Welcome to tonight's journey into Silent Hill. Let me know down in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you're into these long, late night lore dives, subscribing is the easiest way to keep up. Tonight, we examine whether Silent Hill F crosses ethical boundaries or represents authentic, artistic expression. From unprecedented content warnings to the first CERO Z rating in franchise history, we'll explore how the most controversial entry in decades has sparked debates about horror gaming's responsibility, cultural sensitivity, and the limits of interactive storytelling, whether you believe extreme content serves artistic purpose or exploits sensitive themes for shock value. This analysis traces the line between meaningful horror and gratuitous transgression. The release of Silent Hill F has ignited the most significant mature content controversy in the franchise's 26-year history, marking the first time a Silent Hill game has received Japan's maximum 18-plus age rating. However, comprehensive analysis reveals a nuanced landscape where extreme content warnings have generated more anticipation than condemnation, with critics and communities largely viewing the disturbing themes as narratively justified rather than gratuitously excessive. The controversy centers on unprecedented content warnings covering gender discrimination, child abuse, bullying, drug-induced hallucinations, torture, and graphic violence set against 1960s Japanese society. Yet this apparent boundary crossing has earned critical acclaim rather than ethical censure, suggesting the gaming industry's evolving relationship with mature content reflects broader cultural conversations about artistic expression, cultural sensitivity, and social responsibility in interactive media. Historic rating escalation confirms unprecedented content intensity. Silent Hill F represents a genuine escalation in disturbing content rather than merely more explicit content descriptions. The CERO Z rating marks a franchise first. Previous entries, including Silent Hill 2 and 3, received only CERO C 15 plus ratings in Japan, while even Silent Hill Homecoming, banned in Australia until censorship, would have likely received the CERO Z rating had it been released there. The ESRB rating details reveal specific content unprecedented in the series. Official descriptions include a character burned alive inside a cage, a woman branded by a hot iron, entrails and sinew displayed on serving platters in fantastical celebration or ceremony, a character sawing off her own arm, a character slicing off portions of a character's face during a ritual. These explicit descriptions contrast sharply with previous games' more generalized ratings for blood and gore and violence. Konami's official content warning extends beyond typical ESRB descriptors, cautioning players about depictions rooted in customs and culture of 1960s Japan, while explicitly disclaiming that these do not reflect the opinions or values of the developers. This represents the most comprehensive content advisory in Silent Hill history, suggesting awareness of the content's potential impact. International ratings reflect this intensity consistently. Australia initially classified the game as refuse classification before eventual MA 15 plus approval, while Europe assigned PEGI 18. The global convergence on maximum age ratings underscores that Silent Hill F contains genuinely more extreme content than previous franchise entries. The Australian classification controversy provides particularly revealing insight into the content's extremity. The Australian Classification Board's initial refusal occurred through the automated IARC system before human review, suggesting the content descriptions alone triggered maximum classification protocols. Though later reversed, this initial ban demonstrates that Silent Hill F's content warnings describe genuinely transgressive material rather than marketing hyperbole. Beyond rating escalation, the specific content descriptions represent a philosophical shift in how the series approaches horror. Previous Silent Hill games achieved their psychological impact through implication and symbolic representation. Silent Hill F appears to trade metaphorical horror for explicit depiction, raising questions about whether this evolution enhances or undermines the franchise's psychological sophistication. The anatomy of explicit violence, breaking down the content warnings. The ESRB's detailed content descriptions for Silent Hill F read like a catalog of extreme violence that pushes beyond traditional horror game boundaries. These aren't generic descriptions of blood and gore, but specific scenarios that paint disturbing pictures. A character burned alive inside a cage suggests public execution or ritualistic punishment, while a woman branded by a hot iron implies torture specifically targeting female victims. The phrase entrails and sinew displayed on serving platters in fantastical celebration ceremony indicates cannibalistic imagery presented in ritualistic contexts, transforming human remains into ceremonial objects. This represents a significant departure from previous Silent Hill games, where violence typically occurred in isolation rather than as part of organized ritualistic activity. A character sawing off her own arm introduces self-mutilation themes that go beyond the psychological self-harm metaphors of earlier entries. The specificity suggests this occurs as a deliberate narrative moment rather than implied background trauma. Similarly, a character slicing off portions of a character's face during a ritual frames facial mutilation within ceremonial contexts that add cultural weight to already extreme violence. The Steam page's cultural content warning adds another dimension. Depictions of gender discrimination, child abuse, bullying, drug-induced hallucinations, torture, and graphic violence. The inclusion of child abuse, alongside cultural disclaimers about 1960s Japan, suggests the game doesn't shy away from historical realities of how children, particularly girls, were treated in traditional Japanese family structures. Drug-induced hallucinations points to substance abuse themes that previous Silent Hill games approached only metaphorically. The explicit mention suggests characters will be shown using drugs as coping mechanisms, potentially depicting the psychological effects of substance abuse in graphic detail. The torture warning extends beyond simple violence to systematic infliction of pain, while bullying in the context of 1960s Japan implies social cruelty that may involve cultural elements like ostracism, public humiliation, or group persecution that would have carried particular weight in traditional Japanese society. Cultural context, 1960s Japan, and the weight of historical accuracy. The game's setting in 1960s Japan adds layers of complexity to its mature content warnings, as this period represents a crucial moment in Japanese social history, when traditional gender roles collided with emerging women's rights movements. Producer Motoi Okamoto explicitly states, "The reason why we arrived at the 1960s is because this is an era that represents female repression in Japanese society. This historical grounding means the content warnings aren't depicting fictional cruelty, but reflecting documented social realities. Gender discrimination in 1960s rural Japan included practices like arranged marriages, restriction of women's educational opportunities, economic dependence on male family members, and social ostracism for women who challenged traditional roles. The game's disclaimer that depictions do not reflect the opinions or values of the developers acknowledges these historical practices while distancing the creators from endorsing them. The customs and culture disclaimer becomes particularly significant when considering specific practices of the era. Traditional Japanese family structures granted fathers absolute authority over daughters, including decisions about marriage, education, and career paths. Physical discipline of children, particularly daughters who challenged authority, was considered acceptable parenting. The content warning about child abuse likely reflects these historical realities rather than sensationalized fictional violence. Rural Japanese communities in the 1960s maintained strong social hierarchies where individual behavior was scrutinized and punished through community pressure. Bullying in this context might represent traditional forms of social control like village ostracism, public shaming, or exclusion from community activities, practices that could be psychologically devastating in tight-knit rural societies. The drug-induced hallucinations warning takes on additional meaning when considered alongside traditional Japanese medicine and spiritual practices. Rural communities often used herbal remedies and traditional treatments that could produce psychological effects. The game may be depicting characters using these substances as escape mechanisms from social pressures, adding cultural authenticity to what might otherwise seem like generic substance abuse content. Women in 1960s rural Japan faced particular vulnerability to domestic violence, with few legal protections and strong social pressure to endure abuse silently. The torture and graphic violence warnings may reflect this historical reality, depicting the extreme measures some women faced within family structures that legally and socially protected male authority while providing little recourse for female victims. The gender discrimination deep dive, Hinako's impossible choices. At the center of Silent Hill F's controversial content lies the story of Hinako Shimizu, described as a teenage girl struggling under the pressure of expectations from her friends, family, and society. Producer Motoi Okamoto elaborates, one of the main themes that we've expressed is societal pressure, the societal norms that are expected of women. This isn't abstract social commentary, but concrete exploration of how gender discrimination manifested in 1960s Japanese rural communities. Hinako's character description reveals the specific pressures. Cheerful and energetic as a child, she's grown to become much more restrained and now hardly smiles. This transformation reflects documented patterns of how Japanese girls in traditional families were socialized to suppress independent personalities and conform to expected feminine roles. The psychological impact of this forced restraint becomes the foundation for the game's horror elements. The game explores themes around arranged marriages, which remained common in rural Japan during the 1960s. Young women like Hinako face pressure to accept marriages arranged by parents for economic or social advancement, with little consideration for personal preference or compatibility. The horror may emerge from Hinako's resistance to these expectations, and the escalating family pressure that results from her refusal to comply. Educational discrimination provides another layer of historical authenticity. Rural Japanese families often prioritize sons' education while viewing daughters' schooling as temporary preparation for marriage. Hinako's intellectual curiosity and academic ambitions would have been seen as problematic traits requiring correction through family discipline or community intervention. The character profiles reveal family dynamics that reflect historical gender hierarchies. Hinako lives with an abusive father who explodes into violence when crossed, and a mother too frightened to protect her children. alongside the shadow of an older sister who married and left home, representing the expected path Hinako is supposed to follow. This family structure mirrors documented patterns in traditional Japanese households where fathers held absolute authority and mothers, despite their own suffering, were expected to enforce compliance with patriarchal expectations. Economic dependence added another dimension to gender discrimination. Young women had few opportunities for independent income, making resistance to family expectations practically impossible. The game may explore how economic powerlessness trapped women in abusive situations while denying them resources to escape or seek help. Social ostracism served as a powerful tool for enforcing gender compliance. Women who challenged traditional roles faced community rejection, which could extend to their families and affect economic relationships, marriage prospects for siblings, and social standing across generations. The bullying content warning may reflect these community-wide punishment systems that made individual resistance extremely costly. Child abuse in cultural context, beyond Western understandings. The child abuse content warning in Silent Hill Opshi requires understanding within Japanese cultural contexts that differed significantly from Western child rearing practices of the same era. Traditional Japanese family structures granted parents, particularly fathers, extensive authority over children that included physical discipline, strict control over personal choices, and the right to arrange major life decisions without consulting the child's preferences. Physical discipline in 1960s Japanese families often included practices that modern audiences would classify as abuse. Fathers were expected to use physical punishment to enforce obedience, particularly with daughters who showed signs of independence or rebellion. This cultural approach to child rearing, while historically normalized, would register as abusive by contemporary standards. Emotional abuse took forms specific to Japanese culture, including threats of family ostracism, comparisons to more compliant siblings, and warnings about bringing shame to family honor. The game's portrayal of Hinako being constantly compared to her more obedient older sister reflects these psychological manipulation tactics that were considered proper parenting but created lasting trauma. Educational abuse manifested through forced limitation of learning opportunities, particularly for girls whose intellectual curiosity was viewed as problematic. Parents might withdraw daughters from school, restrict access to books, or punish academic achievement if it was seen as encouraging inappropriate independence. Hinako's character suggests intelligence and curiosity that would have been systematically suppressed. Marriage-related abuse involved forcing young women into arranged marriages with older men, often involving financial transactions between families. Girls who resisted faced escalating punishment, including physical violence, social isolation, and threats of permanent family rejection. The horror elements may emerge from Hinako's attempts to avoid this fate, and the increasingly extreme measures her family takes to enforce compliance. Religious or spiritual abuse could involve forced participation in ceremonies, arranged spiritual marriages, or participation in folk practices designed to break individual will and enforce compliance with traditional roles. The game's ritual content warnings may reflect these practices, where spiritual authority was used to justify extreme treatment of resistant children. The game's approach to depicting child abuse appears focused on historical accuracy rather than sensationalism. The cultural disclaimer suggests awareness that these practices reflected historical norms while acknowledging their traumatic impact on victims. This creates educational potential alongside horror entertainment. forcing players to confront uncomfortable historical realities through interactive experience. The torture and violence escalation, from psychological to physical horror. Silent Hill F's explicit descriptions of torture and graphic violence represent a significant departure from the series' traditional approach of using psychological horror and symbolic violence. The ESRB's detailed content description suggests systematic, ritualistic violence that goes beyond the spontaneous brutality of previous games. The character burned alive inside a cage description indicates public execution or ceremonial killing, suggesting violence that serves social or religious functions rather than existing purely for shock value. This type of ritualistic violence would have historical precedence in Japanese culture, where community participation in punishment served to reinforce social order and discourage similar transgression. A woman branded by a hot iron specifically targets female victims and suggests marking or ownership practices that would have historical connections to slavery, concubinage, or punishment for sexual transgression. The gendered nature of this violence aligns with the game's themes about female oppression and may represent historical practices where women who violated sexual or social norms face permanent physical marking. The facial mutilation during a ritual combines physical violence with ceremonial context, suggesting that disfigurement serves symbolic purposes beyond causing pain. In traditional Japanese culture, facial appearance carried particular significance for women, and deliberate disfigurement would have served as both punishment and permanent mark of transgression. Self-mutilation themes indicated by a character sawing off her own arm represent the extreme psychological pressure that could drive individuals to self-harm rather than continue enduring external torture. This reflects documented cases where victims of systematic abuse resort to self-injury as a means of asserting control or escaping unbearable situations. The entrails and sinew displayed on serving platters in fantastical celebration ceremony suggest cannibalistic imagery that may draw from Japanese folklore traditions where consuming parts of enemies or sacrifice victims was believed to transfer power or appease spiritual forces. This combines extreme violence with cultural authenticity in ways that would be particularly disturbing for audiences familiar with these folkloric traditions. The systematic nature of these violent descriptions suggests the game explores how communities can normalize extreme cruelty when it serves perceived social functions. This represents evolution from individual psychological horror toward examination of how social structures enable and perpetuate systematic violence against vulnerable populations. Community and critical reception, the surprising embrace of controversy. Despite the unprecedented content warnings and historic age rating, Silent Hill F has received remarkably positive reception from both gaming critics and community members. This enthusiastic response to obviously controversial content suggests significant shifts in how gaming audiences approach mature themes in horror entertainment. Major gaming outlets consistently praise the game's approach to difficult subject matter rather than condemning it as excessive. GameSpot's review specifically highlighted how the game explores gender roles, agency, isolation, identity, relationships, and womanhood with grace, nuance, and conviction, positioning controversial content as sophisticated social commentary rather than gratuitous shock material. The critical consensus reveals a particular framework for evaluating extreme content in horror games. Reviews consistently emphasized contextual justification, disturbing content serving thematic purpose rather than existing purely for shock value. This suggests critics have developed sophisticated approaches to distinguishing between exploitative and artistic uses of extreme material. IGN's coverage acknowledged the game's extreme content while focusing on narrative effectiveness rather than ethical concerns. The review noted one particularly grisly moment that makes Heavy Rain's infamous pinky severing scene seem like little more than a paper cut, yet positioned this content as enhancing rather than detracting from the experience. Community responses on platforms like Reddit and gaming forums show longtime fans viewing extreme content as validation of the series' return to psychological horror sophistication. Comments frequently express sentiment praising the franchise's willingness to explore disturbing territory that previous entries had avoided. The absence of organized boycotts or major ethical complaints suggests even potentially controversial elements haven't generated significant moral backlash. While individual users expressed reservations about specific content, no coordinated campaigns emerged, arguing the game crossed unacceptable boundaries. Streaming and content creation communities responded with anticipation rather than apprehension. Horror gaming content creators expressed enthusiasm for experiencing controversial content firsthand, suggesting their audiences view intense horror content as appealing rather than problematic. The historical precedent, how Silent Hill earned its mature themes. The positive reception of Silent Hill F's controversial content builds on the franchise's long history of exploring taboo subjects that other horror games avoided. Understanding this controversy requires examining how the series established credibility for handling sensitive material through sophisticated psychological exploration rather than sensationalistic exploitation. Silent Hill 2 remains the franchise benchmark for mature content handled with artistic integrity. The game's exploration of suicide, sexual violence, domestic abuse, and psychological breakdown achieved critical acclaim specifically because these themes served clear narrative purposes and were presented with psychological complexity rather than exploitative sensationalism. The James Sunderland storyline demonstrates how extreme content can enhance rather than diminish artistic impact when properly contextualized. His murder of his wife, the sexual imagery surrounding Pyramid Head encounters, and the game's unflinching examination of guilt and denial created horror through psychological authenticity rather than graphic violence. Silent Hill 3's pregnancy horror and forced transformation themes pushed boundaries around bodily autonomy and reproductive control that were particularly relevant to female experiences. The game's approach to these subjects with psychological depth rather than cheap shock tactics established precedent for how horror games could address sensitive gender-related themes responsibly. The franchise's Western development period provides counterexamples of how mature themes can be mishandled. Silent Hill, Homecoming's torture sequences and explicit violence lacked the psychological justification of earlier games, resulting in content that felt gratuitous rather than meaningful. This contrast explains why Silent Hill F's return to thematically justified extreme content has been welcomed by fans familiar with the series' potential for sophisticated horror. Silent Hill 4. The room explored themes of stalking, isolation, and psychological manipulation through mechanics that made players experience these concepts rather than simply observe them. This interactive approach to disturbing themes created more impactful horror than explicit violence could achieve, providing a model for how Silent Hill F might handle its controversial content. The series' artistic credibility enables audiences to approach new controversial content with assumptions about thematic purpose and psychological sophistication. This established trust allows Silent Hill F to explore extreme themes without facing the skepticism that might greet similar content from franchises without this historical foundation. The cultural authenticity defense, historical accuracy versus entertainment responsibility. Silent Hill F's extensive cultural disclaimers raise complex questions about the relationship between historical authenticity and entertainment responsibility when games depict sensitive cultural content. The game's approach to 1960s Japanese gender discrimination and cultural practices requires balancing educational accuracy with entertainment value while avoiding cultural insensitivity or historical exploitation. The development team's research methodology suggests genuine commitment to cultural authenticity. Their visits to real locations, recording of ambient sounds, and consultation of historical resources in Tokyo libraries demonstrate scholarly approach to cultural representation rather than superficial borrowing of Japanese aesthetics for exotic appeal. Writer Ryukishi 07's cultural background provides additional authenticity that Western developers working with Japanese content typically lack. His experience creating horror narratives rooted in Japanese cultural contexts through works like Higurashi, When They Cry, suggests understanding of how cultural elements can enhance rather than distract from horror effectiveness. The cultural disclaimer, stating that depictions do not reflect the opinions or values of the developers, attempts to separate historical representation from cultural endorsement. This approach acknowledges that accurately depicting historical practices doesn't require approving of them, creating space for educational exploration of problematic cultural elements. However, the entertainment context raises questions about whether historical accuracy justifies including disturbing content that might perpetuate harmful stereotypes about Japanese culture. Critics argue that using cultural authenticity to justify extreme content could reinforce Orientalist perspectives that portray non-Western cultures as inherently more violent or oppressive. The game's approach to gender discrimination themes within Japanese cultural context requires particular sensitivity, as Western audiences might interpret these elements as commentary on Japanese culture generally rather than specific historical practices. The cultural disclaimers attempt to address this concern, but may not prevent misinterpretation by audiences unfamiliar with the distinction. The educational potential of culturally authentic, historical horror creates opportunities to explore serious social issues through interactive experience. If handled responsibly, the game could increase awareness of historical gender discrimination while creating empathy for victims through player identification with the protagonist's struggles. The rating system breakdown, why CERO Z matters. The historic CERO:Z rating assigned to Silent Hill F represents more than administrative classification. It signals fundamental shifts in how horror games approach mature content and how rating systems respond to culturally specific material. Understanding the significance requires examining how ratings function within Japanese cultural contexts and gaming industry practices. CERO's rating system historically showed higher tolerance for psychological horror compared to physical violence, which explains why previous Silent Hill games received lower classifications despite their disturbing themes. The C designation for Silent Hill F indicates content that exceeds these established psychological horror thresholds through explicit depiction rather than implication. The specific triggers for Z classification include graphic violence, explicit sexual content, and depictions of criminal activity. Silent Hill F's content warnings suggest it meets multiple criteria through systematic violence, torture sequences, and depictions of child abuse that move beyond the psychological symbolism of earlier games. Japan's cultural approach to content rating considers not just violence but social impact and cultural sensitivity. The game's exploration of specifically Japanese cultural practices around gender discrimination and family authority may have contributed to the higher rating through cultural specificity rather than simple content extremity. The CERO Z rating creates commercial implications that Konami clearly accepted when choosing not to edit content for lower classification. Games with this rating face advertising restrictions, retail limitations, and reduced market reach, suggesting confidence that artistic integrity justifies commercial costs. International rating variations provide insight into cultural differences in content evaluation. While Japan assigned CERO Z 18+ age rating, other regions gave equivalent but different classifications, indicating that cultural context affects not just content creation but content interpretation by rating authorities. The rating serves accessibility functions beyond simple age restriction, providing detailed information that allows consumers to make informed decisions about content that might be particularly triggering or inappropriate for personal circumstances. This supports arguments that comprehensive content warnings serve consumer protection rather than censorship. Industry context, horror games, and the mature content evolution. Silent Hill F's controversial content emerges within broader gaming industry evolution toward more sophisticated approaches to mature themes in horror entertainment. Understanding the significance requires examining how horror games have developed more complex relationships with extreme content over recent years. The success of games like The Last of Us, Outlast, and Resident Evil 7 demonstrated market appetite for horror games that tackle serious themes through extreme content when properly contextualized. These successes created industry confidence that audiences could handle disturbing material when it serves clear artistic purposes. The horror gaming community has demonstrated sophisticated understanding of content, warning systems, and their purposes. Community discussions show appreciation for detailed advisories as accessibility features rather than evidence of censorship, indicating audience maturation around mature content evaluation. Academic interest in horror games as artistic medium has provided critical frameworks for evaluating extreme content through artistic rather than purely moral lenses. Scholarly attention legitimizes sophisticated horror games as worthy of serious analysis rather than dismissal as exploitation entertainment. Gaming's controversial parallels, how other titles have navigated similar territory. Silent Hill F's controversial content exists within a broader landscape of games that have explored taboo subjects, including historical trauma, gender discrimination, child abuse, and extreme violence. Understanding how other titles have approached similar themes reveals the unique position Silent Hill F occupies in gaming's complex relationship with mature content. Rule of Rose represents perhaps the most direct comparison to Silent Hill F's controversial subject matter. Released in 2006 by Punchline, this PlayStation 2 survival horror explored themes of child abuse, gender dynamics, and psychological manipulation in 1930s England through the story of Jennifer, trapped with a group of sadistic young girls calling themselves the Red Crayon Aristocrats. The game sparked massive controversy based largely on misinformation, with European politicians claiming it featured burying children alive and sadomasochistic content toward minors, claims that were entirely false but led to bans across multiple countries. The controversy surrounding Rule of Rose demonstrates how cultural misunderstanding can destroy a game's commercial viability. Unlike Silent Hill F, which has received critical acclaim despite its content warnings, Rule of Rose faced systematic political opposition from officials who had never played the game. Italian journalist Guido Castellano condemned the title based on plagiarized reviews, spreading misinformation that the game's objective was to violate a little girl in the most horrible conditions. The resulting moral panic led to bans in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, turning Rule of Rose into a rare collector's item worth hundreds of dollars today. However, those who actually experienced Rule of Rose found sophisticated psychological horror that respectfully explored gender dynamics, power structures, and childhood trauma without explicit content. The game examined how children establish hierarchies in the absence of adult supervision, creating a Lord of the Flies dynamic that felt psychologically authentic rather than exploitative. This gap between perceived content and actual experience mirrors Silent Hill F's situation, where detailed content warnings have generated more intrigue than outrage among those familiar with horror gaming's artistic potential. Spec Ops: The Line demonstrates how games can successfully present extreme violence and torture within frameworks that justify controversial content through thematic purpose. Released in 2012, this military shooter subverted genre expectations by forcing players to confront the psychological consequences of warfare through increasingly disturbing scenarios, including the infamous white phosphorus scene where players unknowingly massacre a refugee camp. The game's approach to controversial content differs significantly from Silent Hill F's historical authenticity framework, where Silent Hill F uses cultural disclaimers to separate historical representation from contemporary values. Spec Ops: The Line deliberately implicates players in moral choices without clear justification. The torture sequences, including soldiers terrorizing civilians by shooting burning sand next to their faces, serve to make players uncomfortable with their own participation in violence rather than educating about historical practices. Writer Walt Williams explicitly designed disturbing content to evoke player anger and discomfort, stating that players could end the experience by simply putting down the controller. This meta-commentary on gaming violence creates different ethical considerations than Silent Hill F's cultural exploration approach. While both games use extreme content to serve larger purposes, Spec Ops: The Line critiques gaming culture directly, while Silent Hill F examines historical cultural practices through horror storytelling. This war of mind takes yet another approach to controversial themes by focusing on civilian experiences during wartime rather than combat heroics. The 2014 survival game forces players to control groups of non-combatant survivors, making desperate moral choices during a siege, including decisions about theft, murder, and sacrifice that would be unthinkable in normal circumstances. The game's controversial elements emerge from moral ambiguity rather than explicit content. Players might choose to rob elderly couples for medicine, allow children to starve to save stronger survivors, or commit violent acts to protect their group. These scenarios create psychological discomfort through player agency rather than graphic depiction, demonstrating how games can explore serious themes without relying on explicit violence or cultural sensitivity concerns. This War of Mind's critical acclaim and commercial success indicate that audiences can appreciate mature themes when properly contextualized within meaningful gameplay systems. The game received praise for its anti-war message and realistic portrayal of civilian trauma, showing how controversial subject matter can enhance rather than detract from artistic impact when integrated thoughtfully into game design. The differences in reception and commercial outcome between these titles reveal important factors that determine public acceptance of controversial gaming content. Rule of Rose suffered from misinformation campaigns and political opposition that prevented fair critical evaluation, while This War of Mine benefited from clear anti-war messaging that aligned with progressive values. Spec Ops. The line gained critical respect through its meta-commentary on gaming culture but achieved limited commercial success due to its deliberately uncomfortable experience. Silent Hill F appears positioned to avoid Rule of Rose's fate through comprehensive content warnings and cultural sensitivity measures, while potentially achieving broader success than Spec Ops. The line, through its focus on historical authenticity rather than player guilt, the game's approach of presenting controversial content within educational frameworks about historical gender discrimination provides justification that resonates with contemporary discussions about cultural awareness and historical representation. Other notable titles have explored similar thematic territory with varying degrees of success. Heavy Rain included torture sequences and child endangerment themes, but framed them within detective thriller contexts that felt less culturally sensitive. The Last of Us series depicts extreme violence against and by minors but contextualizes it within post-apocalyptic survival scenarios that distance the content from real-world applications. Grand Theft Auto games routinely feature torture, violence against women, and cultural stereotypes, but frame them within satirical contexts that provide some critical distance from their controversial elements. However, these games have faced ongoing criticism for potentially normalizing problematic attitudes through their comedic approach to serious subjects. The key distinction appears to be whether controversial content serves clear artistic or educational purposes versus existing primarily for shock value or entertainment. Games that successfully navigate controversial territory typically provide frameworks for understanding why disturbing content is necessary for their artistic goals, while titles that face lasting criticism often include controversial elements without sufficient justification or context. Silent Hill F's approach combines elements from successful, controversial games while avoiding pitfalls that destroyed others. Like Rule of Rose, it explores historical gender discrimination and abuse themes through psychological horror, but provides comprehensive content warnings and cultural disclaimers that prevent misinformation campaigns. Like Spec Ops: The Line, it includes extreme violence and torture, but frames them within historical authenticity rather than player complicity. Like This War of Mine, it examines civilian trauma and moral ambiguity, but through individual character development rather than survival mechanics. The game's success in generating positive critical reception despite unprecedented content warnings suggests the gaming industry has matured in its to evaluate controversial content through artistic rather than purely moral frameworks. Unlike Rule of Rose's era, contemporary gaming discourse includes sophisticated discussions about cultural representation, historical accuracy, and artistic freedom that provide context for evaluating extreme content. This evolution reflects broader cultural conversations about how entertainment media can responsibly address serious social issues, including historical trauma, gender discrimination, and cultural sensitivity. Silent Hill F benefits from timing that allows these discussions to occur within established frameworks, for evaluating artistic merit versus exploitative content, enabling more nuanced reception than earlier controversial titles received. The psychological horror evolution from implication to explicit depiction. Silent Hill F's approach to extreme content represents broader evolution in how psychological horror games balance suggestion with explicit depiction. This shift reflects changing audience expectations, technical capabilities, and artistic philosophies about what constitutes effective horror in interactive media. Traditional Silent Hill games achieved psychological impact through environmental storytelling, symbolic monster design, and implied violence that allowed players' imaginations to fill disturbing gaps. This approach relied on psychological principles that suggested horror can be more effective when partially concealed rather than fully revealed. Modern horror games face different technical and artistic constraints that enable explicit depiction while creating new challenges for maintaining psychological effectiveness. High-definition visuals and realistic character modeling allow developers to show disturbing content that earlier hardware could only suggest through abstraction. The shift toward explicit content reflects changing audience sophistication and desensitization that may require more intense stimuli to achieve equivalent psychological impact. Modern horror audiences exposed to explicit content through various media may need stronger material to experience the vulnerability and helplessness that earlier audiences felt from subtle implications. Silent Hill F's approach suggests attempting to combine explicit content with psychological sophistication rather than replacing psychological horror with graphic violence. The detailed content warnings describe extreme violence within ritualistic and cultural contexts that add psychological complexity to physical horror. The challenge for modern psychological horror lies in maintaining emotional impact while increasing explicit content. Games that rely purely on graphic violence without psychological foundation typically create desensitization rather than lasting horror, while games that maintain psychological complexity can use explicit content to enhance rather than replace emotional impact. The interactive nature of gaming creates different psychological effects from passive media consumption. Players who control characters through traumatic experiences may require different balances of explicit and implied content to maintain emotional engagement without creating overwhelming psychological stress. Content warnings as accessibility features. The new paradigm. The extensive content warnings accompanying Silent Hill F represent evolving industry recognition that detailed advisories serve accessibility functions rather than censorship mechanisms. This paradigm shift changes how extreme content is presented and consumed in interactive entertainment. Traditional content rating systems provided broad categories that helped parents make decisions about age-appropriate content, but offered limited information for adults managing personal triggers or trauma responses. Modern content warning systems enable more nuanced consumer choice by providing specific information about potentially problematic themes. The gaming accessibility movement has championed content warnings as essential features for players managing mental health conditions, trauma histories, or cultural sensitivities. These warnings allow informed consent rather than content avoidance, enabling players to prepare psychologically or choose appropriate contexts for engaging with challenging material. Silent Hill F's implementation represents industry best practices for comprehensive content advisories. The warnings specify not just violent content but cultural context, historical setting, and thematic elements that might create psychological discomfort for certain audiences. This thoroughness enables more precise consumer decision making. The cultural disclaimer adds another layer of accessibility by acknowledging that historical representation doesn't constitute contemporary endorsement. This helps audiences separate educational historical content from problematic cultural messaging while maintaining artistic freedom to explore sensitive themes. Research supports content warnings as accessibility features rather than censorship mechanisms when properly implemented. Studies show detailed warnings allow audiences to engage safely with challenging content rather than avoiding it entirely, increasing rather than decreasing access to artistic expression. The success of content warning databases and community-driven advisory systems indicates consumer demand for transparency that exceeds traditional rating system capabilities. This suggests future industry evolution toward even more detailed information systems that support informed consumer choice. Economic implications, controversy as marketing or liability. Despite extensive content warnings and historic age ratings, Silent Hill F's commercial performance suggests market acceptance of extreme content when properly contextualized and marketed. The relationship between controversy and commercial success in horror gaming reveals complex dynamics that challenge assumptions about audience preferences. Pre-order data and early sales figures indicate content warnings haven't significantly reduced consumer interest, with many buyers viewing extreme content as value added rather than problematic. The horror gaming market has demonstrated consistent demand for authentic experiences that challenge emotional boundaries rather than provide comfortable entertainment. The Australian classification controversy generated significant media attention that likely increased international awareness rather than reducing sales. Gaming controversies frequently function as unintentional marketing campaigns, with content warnings signaling authentic horror experiences to genre enthusiasts seeking intense emotional challenges. Digital distribution platforms report that horror games with comprehensive content warnings often perform better commercially than those without detailed advisories. This counterintuitive finding suggests consumers appreciate transparency and view detailed warnings as indicators of substantive content rather than problematic material. Konami's pricing strategy, maintaining standard full price positioning despite content controversy, indicates publisher confidence in market acceptance. Major publishers typically reduce prices or limit marketing for potentially controversial titles, suggesting Konami views extreme content as commercially advantageous rather than risky. International market analysis shows consistent demand across regions with varying content standards, indicating that cultural sensitivity concerns haven't significantly impacted global commercial performance. This suggests comprehensive content warnings successfully address cultural considerations without reducing commercial viability. The horror gaming market segment continues growing despite increasing content extremity, with consumers actively seeking experiences that provide psychological challenge and emotional intensity. Silent Hill F appears positioned to benefit from this trend toward authentic horror experiences rather than suffering from content controversy. Conclusion: redefining boundaries through responsible transgression. The Silent Hill F mature content controversy reveals a gaming industry increasingly comfortable with intense subject matter when framed through artistic merit and cultural commentary. Despite unprecedented content warnings and historic age ratings, the dominant response frames disturbing elements as authentic, artistic expression rather than gratuitous boundary crossing. Critical and community reception suggests the controversy generated more anticipation than condemnation, with professional reviews consistently defending mature themes as narratively justified, and longtime fans viewing extreme content as validation of the series' return to psychological horror sophistication. The game's approach to cultural sensitivity through detailed disclaimers and historical context provides a potential template for how horror games might handle sensitive material responsibly. The controversy ultimately demonstrates gaming's maturation as an artistic medium capable of addressing serious themes, including cultural oppression, historical trauma, and social commentary through horror frameworks, rather than representing exploitation or ethical violation. Silent Hill F appears positioned as expanding what interactive horror can meaningfully explore while maintaining awareness of its potential impact through comprehensive content warnings and cultural sensitivity considerations. The economic success, despite extreme content warnings, indicates audiences increasingly appreciate transparency and contextual justification over sanitized experiences. Silent Hill F demonstrates that horror games can cross traditional boundaries while maintaining artistic integrity and cultural sensitivity, provided developers approach transgressive content with serious artistic purpose and comprehensive player communication. The lasting significance may be less about whether specific content goes too far and more about establishing frameworks for responsible artistic expression in interactive media that addresses serious cultural and historical themes through horror storytelling. Silent Hill F suggests the gaming industry can handle mature content controversies through transparent communication, artistic justification, and cultural awareness rather than censorship or avoidance of challenging subject matter. Perhaps most importantly, the overwhelmingly positive reception despite extreme content warnings indicates that audiences increasingly appreciate authentic, artistic expression that respects their intelligence and provides necessary information for informed consent. Silent Hill F appears to have successfully navigated the complex territory between artistic freedom and social responsibility, creating a model for how horror games can responsibly explore transgressive themes while respecting both cultural sensitivity and player agency. The game's critical acclaim and commercial success suggest that the future of horror gaming may involve more explicit engagement with difficult themes rather than retreat into safer territory. By combining historical authenticity, cultural sensitivity, and artistic sophistication with comprehensive content, warnings, and contextual justification, Silent Hill F demonstrates that horror games can push boundaries responsibly while maintaining both commercial viability and critical respect. This approach to controversial content, combining artistic ambition with social awareness, may establish new industry standards for how horror games handle sensitive material. Rather than avoiding difficult subjects or exploiting them for shock value, Silent Hill F shows how developers can engage seriously with historical and cultural trauma while respecting both artistic freedom and audience well-being. The controversy surrounding Silent Hill F thus represents not just debate about appropriate content limits, but evolution toward more sophisticated approaches to interactive horror that can address serious social issues without sacrificing entertainment value or cultural sensitivity. The positive reception suggests audiences are ready for horror games that challenge them intellectually and emotionally while providing the information necessary for informed engagement with potentially disturbing material.